Robert E. Lee's surrender at the Appomattox courthouse on April 9th signaled the end of the Civil War, but why was Appomattox the place where Lee surrendered? By 1865, the South was in a very poor situation. They were running low on manpower and supplies, all while the Union was gaining more manpower as black soldiers began flocking to the military in the hopes of finally ending slavery in the United States. In June 1864, the Union pushed to finally capture the Confederate capital of Richmond as the Army of the Potomac crossed the James River. They quickly laid siege to the important supply and railroad city of Petersburg, south of Richmond, in order to cripple any and all Confederate supplies in order to force them to evacuate. For over 9 months, the Confederates skillfully and brutally defended against a larger Union force by using trenches and field fortifications. However, aware that their defenses and supplies would not hold out much longer, General Lee, in order to continue the Confederate cause, left Richmond and Petersburg in order to obtain supplies and more troops from Danville or Lynchburg. His plan was to join General Johnston's men against General Sherman in North Carolina in order to defeat him and to prevent Sherman and Grant from combining forces. Then Lee's army might have a chance of defeating Grant, or at least continue the war. In order to break the Union lines east of Petersburg and bring his army to Johnston, General Lee accepted a plan by Major John B. Gordon to launch an attack on the Union fort Stedman. On March 25th, their attack initially went well, taking the fort in 3 batteries, but the Confederates were soon put under deadly crossfire as General Parke led a counterattack that inflicted 2,900 casualties. This loss was a devastating blow for Lee's army. So as you can see, the Confederates were in complete disarray as some of their most important cities, including their capital, were about to be captured. On April 3rd, the Confederate capital of Richmond was finally captured as Lee could no longer sustain a defense due to the Confederate defeat at the Battle of the Five Forks, which not only took out thousands of Confederate troops, but destroyed Lee's final supply line, leading to even more desertion, disease, and hunger. When Lee abandoned Richmond and Petersburg, his army retreated along the Richmond and Danville Railroad. However, Lee's army was still in major trouble as they tried to outrun the Union with extremely low supplies. Nevertheless, the Confederates marched on in some grueling night marches in order to quickly reach supply trains in Farmville, Virginia. Many Confederates gave up their lives, covering Lee, just for the chance for him to carry on. But unfortunately, the Confederates could not stop as they were still being pressured by the Union, who eventually captured the valuable supplies at Farmville. On the night of April 7th, Lee received a letter from Grant requesting him to surrender, which stated, "The result of last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle. I feel that it is so, and regard it as my duty to shift from myself any further effusion of blood by asking of you the surrender of a portion of the CS Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia." The stubborn Lee responded, "I have received your note of this date, though not entertaining the opinion you express of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia. I reciprocate your desire to avoid useless effusion of blood, and therefore, before considering your proposition, ask the terms you will offer on condition of its surrender." Hoping to at least get to Appomattox Station before he was completely trapped, Lee sent the letter back asking for the terms Grant might propose. To make the Confederate situation even more dire, a Union cavalry division under George Custer seized a supply train and 25 guns at Appomattox Station, not only taking away Lee's supplies but also blocking his path. But even as the sun rose on April 9th in Appomattox, General Lee still had hope that his men could break through the thin Union cavalry line, find supplies and rations, and continue the fight to the south. However, the cavalry line was not broken, and the Confederates remained surrounded on 3 sides. So the Confederates at this point now basically have no supplies, are outnumbered, surrounded, and have no reinforcement prospects. It is at this moment when Lee faced Union cavalry and infantry in front of him, 2 Union corps 3 miles behind him, and the Army of the James around him, when he finally came to the realization that his fighting hour was over, and that there was simply no possibility of escape. Lee stated, "Then there is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." Lee wrote to Grant asking him to meet in order to discuss the terms of surrender, though troops were still fighting as communications regarding a surrender went back and forth between Grant and Lee. Just before noon, Lee sent a message to Grant's lines asking suspension of hostilities pending the discussion of the terms of surrender of his army. The home of Wilmer McLean, whose house had served as the Confederate headquarters during one of the first major battles of the Civil War, the first Battle of Bull Run nearly 4 years earlier, was selected to host the negotiations. Lee arrived first at 1 p.m. wearing his finest dress uniform along with Lieutenant Colonel Charles Marshall. Grant, his his personal staff and generals Phil Sheridan and Edward Ort arrived late due to Grant's bad headache. He was wearing a muddy private's uniform with only his shoulder straps denoting his rank. Grant and Lee were very cordial as they discussed the old army and their time during the Mexican War. Grant's terms to Lee were extremely gracious, a testament on how he would run the country later as president. Lee officially surrendered his 28,000-man army of Northern Virginia at 3 p.m., accepting the terms Grant had proposed by letter the previous day. The Confederates, with the exception of officers, laid down their arms and after signing paroles returned to their homes. Grant also allowed the men to take back their horses and gave the starving men rations. Union soldiers were ordered not to celebrate or taunt, as Grant stated, "The Confederates were now our countrymen, and we did not want to exult over their downfall." Lee could have continued a guerrilla warfare campaign that would have undoubtedly lasted years and maybe even decades, but he chose peace and reconstruction of the nation instead. Not only did he lay down his arms when rightfully beaten, his surrender was followed by countless other Confederate forces, including the largest during the Civil War, General Johnston's 90,000-man army. Lee may have surrendered later than he should have, but his decision to surrender Appomattox was truly the right decision, as it saved thousands of lives.